If you or someone you know struggles with addiction, stay right here for the Recovery Boys. Lewis Finch and Macon Moy discuss alcoholism, drug addiction, co-occurring disorders, and life in recovery. And now, here's Lewis and Macon.
I'm Macon.
And I'm Lewis.
And
we're the Recovery Boys.
All right, Lewis, how you doing today?
Doing good, mate.
Good.
We're good. I
Well,
haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah. You were traveling, and I've been back and forth to Southern Pines, but we have continued to stay busy. It always amazes me how many people are reaching out for help these days.
Listen, I was gone. I've been gone since early in the week, and I watched the email exchange that come in, and we start the day with no one on the books, and we end the day with 4 people on the books.
Yeah.
And they just keep coming.
And I don't think it's going to slow down.
No.
Even though the COVID thing seems to have, we were talking about it a little bit earlier, the COVID story seems to have been relegated down the list now that this little Putin
skirmish
invasion, and whatever, that's going to lead the news. But I'm excited about our guest today.
Very much.
Why don't you tell everybody who we're going to be talking to?
We kind of we prefaced this last week, I think, didn't we?
Yeah.
One of the people that when I first got into this business back in 2014, and came back to Raleigh, and decided this was what I was going to be doing, there were a handful of folks who kept coming up in conversations with people that I had met in the field, and one of them was this gentleman. I know he probably never been heard that before, but he is a gentleman, and he's a scholar, and he is everything that's right with the treatment in this field.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
In fact, he's been doing this an awful long time. I mean, you and I we're like neophytes in this field. We did the damage on the front end, and just recently in the last, me since 2014, you for the last 5 years or so.
Yeah.
Jeff's been doing this long, but Jeff Georgia is our guest today, and Jeff, I just want to thank you for coming today, and we're excited to have you.
But you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and it's funny. I told my wife Taylor when I was leaving. She said, "Where are you going so early for?" I said, "We're going to record Recovery Boys." She said, "Oh, you having a guest?" I said, "Yeah, Jeff Georgia." She said, "Oh." She said, "I'll have to call everybody and tell them." I was like, "Well, how about last week?"
Yeah, exactly. That was just us.
Yeah, it was just us. Yeah, but we're excited to talk to Jeff about a number of things.
Mm-hmm. So Jeff, we talked about this before. I mean, everybody's story is different. We all get here a little bit differently. You've been doing this for so long, and you have been one of those, whether you like to hear it or not, one of the godfathers of addiction treatment, at least in this area and probably the Southeast. Can you kind of give the folks who are viewing this, listening in, an idea of how this came about?
Well, sure. I mean, I like so many of us, came from a family that was committed to alcohol consumption, and I had to look at my own as well, and so I got through that door. But clinically, I started in 1982 in the first methadone clinic in Durham, North Carolina, with a wonderful physician, Charlie Llewellyn, who taught me so much about not only treatment, but the underlying biology and psychological aspects of the disease. And from there, I actually did which a lot of people don't know, I actually worked attached to the federal bench for a while as a federal probation officer, specializing in drug and alcohol cases and treatment.
Here in the Triangle?
Middle District of North Carolina, so we're in the Eastern District, so over in Durham and Greensboro. And from there I went to Duke and spent the rest, really, I'm still at Duke, even though I'm now in private practice with my wife, Becky. But I've really seen the field change from really kind of not knowing what we were doing and looking at it almost exclusively through an AA lens, which I think is an important way to seek to seek recovery. But as if Becky were here, she would say, don't forget to talk about the difference between treatment and recovery.
Oh, that's a great point.
And I really think there is. And over the decades I've been involved, we've moved from a vague understanding of this as a disease to being clear that it's a disease to then starting talking about brain disease. And now we recognize that that's wrong. Although the brain is the dominant organ that obviously is involved in this illness, it's a whole body. And I mean, it involves every organ. It involves our culture. It involves our family systems. It involves everything. And if we, as a treating group and field, don't expand our lens, we may help that one individual for the short term, but then he's going to go back into his environment. And if we haven't helped them, like you guys do here with families, he or she's going to be in trouble.
Well,
so
we talk about that when you send someone back, that if the family hadn't grown with them,
right.
you send them right back into a sick environment, and you wonder why they relapse or return to what they're doing. I would like for you to kind of touch on something though. You mentioned Duke, and I know that's where I found out about you. I didn't know the prior stuff about the court system. Explain, because that's 30 plus years ago, right? If you don't mind, kind of timeline it, because I know when you started, you were developing a lot of what is now known as evidence-based medicine, right? Or evidence-based. So you actually formulate a lot of this stuff, or at least helped to be a part of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, back in I started at Duke in 1990, and they were just beginning to formulate some kind of treatment intervention. We started with an adolescent program, an intensive outpatient program. We moved. I then developed a consult service to the tertiary care hospital, so I would go into the general medicine, general surgery departments and work with physicians and young residents to teach them how to identify addiction and because they, again, I think medicine unfortunately gets a hit for this, but young physicians aren't trained to either identify or deal with the disease we treat.
Right.
So it's hard to be judgmental about people who don't know and aren't taught. So anyway, my job is
we just assume that they are.
They do, right. They know everything. Well, they don't know about this, and it's not their fault. It's our fault as a treatment field not to be more aggressive. And so my job was to go in and train, but also to identify patients who came in for a heart attack, but in reality also had an underlying aggressive alcohol use disorder, or somebody who came in with cancer or with out of control diabetes and had another form of addictive illness expression. So once I started identifying these people, the question was, well, what do you do?
Yeah, what do we do with them?
What do you do with them?
Now we know they're there. What are we going to do?
Right, and so then Duke developed, and Paul Nagy and I worked together developing an intensive outpatient program, which eventually grew to an traditional IOP, then to we had a mindfulness track.
Back then.
Wow. And we were looked at as eggheads, but it was really powerful.
Wow.
We had a woman-specific program. We had a mother-child program.
And this was open to the public, wasn't just the students, right?
No, this was
Okay.
all. This was
Part of Duke's
part
hospital
of Duke,
system?
part of Duke clinical care,
Gotcha.
and it was wonderful. And we continued to grow and expand. We eventually developed an inpatient unit for the medically fragile, psychiatrically fragile, substance-using patient, so we could take somebody who had just raging cellulitis because they'd been using IV drugs and had been not cleaning the needle, which often they don't, and they were too ill to leave the hospital, but we could take them, put them in that special unit, treat their medical condition. If they also had major depression, do that as well, and treat their substance use disorder all at the same time.
That's unheard of back then.
It was
It's
wonderful.
barely heard of now. I mean, to your point, it's finally coming to fruition, but that was cutting edge.
It was exciting. It really was.
Yeah.
we had wonderful clinicians, and about 10 years ago, and this is a sadness for me, somewhere in the structure of Duke, they made a decision that they were going to make a shift from the clinical approach to a research approach. And right now, there is almost all that stuff that I just described at Duke is gone.
That's a shame.
What?
Because the need certainly hasn't.
Oh yeah,
exactly.
gotten smaller.
and we've got a huge research commitment, and I'm part of that now. I mean, I'm adjunct faculty now in the Center for Addiction and Behavioral Change,
Right.
and that's a part of the Department of Psychiatry, and so the research piece is still being addressed aggressively, but we're not doing the clinical work.
Right.
So where do you think that, because that piece had to go somewhere. Where has it, when you guys stopped doing it, where has it gone in this area?
Well, I mean, some of it's here.
Right, some of it's here.
Some of it's here. A lot of it, we still need to get the teaching hospitals back in doing this kind of stuff. I mean, there's a program at UNC, but it's nowhere near as developed as we were, and that's not a judgment on them. You've got to have the administrative support in order to do
Right.
that. And so I think a lot of it has gone to programs like Wellwind, but there are not enough Wellwinds. We need a Wellwind in Durham. We need a Wellwind in Chapel Hill. We need because there's not only a treatment gap, but there's a quality gap, and that sounds kind of ugly, but I don't mean it.
No,
in
I
judgment,
totally understand what you're saying.
But this is a complex, challenging disease, and you need to have a program that is able to deal with the complexities that you guys see on a daily basis. And you don't get easy patients that from me.
We were just talking about that, but it's unfortunate. The space has attracted a lot of money. There's a lot of money for the substance abuse, or for now mental illness is becoming more of a conversation. And unfortunately, when a space develops that kind of revenue, it also develops a lot of bad actors.
Yep, that's
And
right.
there's a lot of people in this business now just for money. And that's unfortunate, because what we do here and what you do is we invest ourselves in our clients.
Mhm.
We take a personal stake. We're not trying to run them in and out to see how much money we can reach into their pockets and grab. We're actually trying to increase quality of life. Because somebody did that for us.
Right.
Quite
Well,
honestly.
and also, Mike, I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but then you've got the insurance component,
Mhm.
which further takes us down that path of that's who's dictating treatment in a lot of cases.
Well, and that was one of the things we were able to argue with a certain degree of energy back when I was at Duke full time, was to an insurance company, which would you rather do? Pay for alcohol treatment or a new liver? Liver
Absolutely.
transplantation is expensive, guys.
Yeah.
And so you could
Oh, yeah.
use that lever to help insurance companies realize, well, maybe this would. What has happened to that argument, I honestly don't know. And I do want to follow up on the quality piece, because what I see, because I'm now in private practice with Becky, and she's over at UNC doing a collegiate program and all that stuff. What we see is a lot of the programs that we used to value being bought up by big conglomerates.
That's what happens.
And once that happens, some of the best programs become homogenized, and there's no.
Well, because they to your point, the people that are controlling the purse strings, it's not about serving the betterment of mankind. It's about the dollar. And I get it. I'm an entrepreneur. I work. I have to eat. I have to put roof over my head. I get all that. But there comes a time that when you turn over the care of someone to someone that sits somewhere in an office that doesn't even see the patient, that we've lost the game at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I know the people that we bring in here, who we talk about this quite often. I won't say we scholarship them. We will help them we'll help them pay for their treatment any way we can. And we've said this about ourselves all the time, that if you want an easy mark, we're it.
Yeah. Well, it's because profit is, as Lewis always says, we're a for-profit business, just not yet.
It's not yet.
And so that's, but we if we were just doing this for money, we would have a completely different
Business
company
model.
profile.
Oh,
We
yeah.
just would. And we, we're just having a conversation with a gentleman who was in here talking about a different kind of system that that we're going to take a look at. But we tried to explain to him that profit. I mean, we'd like to cover our expenses, but we're not trying to see how much money we can drip out of this machine.
Well, the companies you're referring to are private equity and venture capital. They're driven. The objective of those companies is to increase shareholder equity. It's in their business plan. I get it. Unfortunately, I don't know that the way that they treat our clientele in a lot of cases meets the demand they're trying to meet. It may serve the dollar issue, but I don't think it. Well, here's a good example. So you go to insurance companies tell you how long you can stay in the residential treatment programs.
Right, which is ridiculous.
Right. It's totally. I mean, we would never bring somebody here and they go, "Well, your insurance just ran out. Sign a leave." But it happens all the time. I was incredulous when I found that out. I felt like an idiot too. I went, "I'm the only guy that doesn't kick you out if your insurance stops paying." I'm being serious. But how do you do that with the right mind?
Sadly, this is not the only field where the dollar has impacted treatment. I think it's particularly virulent in our field because, guys, we're not a high-end dollar. I mean,
We're not.
again, and I'm obviously, if somebody needs a liver transplant, I was on the liver transplant team for years. I am committed to that, and but that is a high-end dollar intervention.
No question.
And our patients just aren't.
Right.
And I think it really is an issue of economics, which is frustrating because we have never been at a place where we have more clinical options than we do now.
Exactly right.
Absolutely agree.
Yes.
And it is so frustrating not to be able to help not only patients but young clinicians learn how to use what we've got now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's astonishing to me when I am talking to an inpatient treatment facility and asking, "Well, are you going to be discharging your patient on naltrexone or no?" And I'm going, "Oh dear, we have a problem."
Well, and it's interesting you bring this up because when I first got in this business, I was working in a residential program. We had a discharge person, but and I remember my discharge plan. They didn't mention me going to treatment after the thing. My discharge plan was go to 90 meetings in 90 days, get a sponsor, and work the steps. I've still got it written down. I still know where it is. And it was no mention of going anywhere else to get more treatment. So, and if you consider the fact that my best thinking was what got me there, trying to convince me to do that, I did it. I still to this day don't understand why, other than I guess I remember the pain of what I'd gone through. But now you're seeing since we've been open, we're seeing more of people being discharged to outpatient programs when they come back from that. We do the same thing here. If someone steps down and completes our program, we have an outpatient. We have an intensive outpatient part. We have an outpatient part, and we have individual therapy, and we have the family program too. We can step them down so far, but if they leave us, we will refer them to an individual therapist or another program. But this is a lifetime of healing.
Well, and I wish Becky were here because if there is the drum she beats loudly, it's that. I mean, she works primarily with the collegiate population, but if the inpatient treatment programs, the residential treatment programs, they don't have any sense of what is available or not available at the academic. They don't communicate with the universities. Mm-hmm. If they are lucky enough to by accident bump into a university program, they don't talk about what's available in the treatment community in that community. So it's that there's a complete breakdown in case management and pass off and what you're talking about. And this is, and we all know this, it's a lifelong disease. I wish we had a magic wand, but I failed that class. Well, I missed it, one or the other. I don't know which one it was, but we've got to realize that this is a disease that, and I think COVID, if ever there was a time, gentlemen, that I've been reminded of how this is an unforgiving and unforgetting illness. I am literally seeing people I was privileged to treat 10, 15 years ago who've been in sustained recovery, who've loved it, are getting on the phone and saying, Jeff, I've started drinking again. Can I come back? And of course the answer is of course. But that's, I mean.
But and that didn't happen to the volume you're saying now. That's what you're saying, right?
Oh, it's going crazy. No, I do the best I can to take on new patients, but by and large, the only people I'm now seeing that are quote unquote new are not new. These are people I saw
In
8,
relapse.
9, 10. Yeah, and it is. I mean, to lose a big period, and you guys know this, to lose a significant period of remission. There's not only the illness piece, but then there's the guilt and the shame.
No question about it.
And it's even worse.
Yeah.
Because their family's now mad at them again. They feel like they failed again, and it's like, wait a minute, guys, I've got asthma. If I have an asthma attack, is anybody going to tell me I've failed?
No,
They're going to treat it.
Yeah, that's unfortunately. I think a lot of us, when we hit recovery, the people that love us and care about us are so elated. We raise their expectation, and so and we're people pleasers. A lot of us that are in, that have this disease, and so when we do let them down, and let's face it, a lot of the families and a lot of the support people that are around us are waiting for that to happen anyway.
Yeah.
Because of our past performance was so incredible that they have a hard time believing we can just walk away from it. I can't tell you how many times people ask me, said, "You really not drinking?" Because they knew how good I was at drinking, and so when we fail, unfortunately, it's usually very publicized, and that does add to the guilt and shame.
Are you seeing a common theme as to why these people are telling you they're relapsing?
The stress of loneliness.
Isolation, and Jeff and I
Yes.
were talking about it earlier, and that's what we see when we're in our intervention work. When we find somebody who's gone into the isolation mode, they're ripe for getting help or going a little bit deeper into the wormhole.
And I was telling this to Macon. Our current Surgeon General, Murphy, just wrote a book called Together, and it's a elegant work on the power of connection and how that is an integral part of all forms of medical healing.
Interesting.
And he specifically isolates our illness, the illness that we treat and live with, and says we can't afford I think it's an eloquent phrase. We can't afford the luxury of loneliness. And it's also interesting. He differentiates between loneliness, aloneness, and solitude. Solitude's a good thing.
Yeah.
Loneliness is a bad thing. And what COVID has done, it's pushed people into their little cubby holes, and it's gotten in the way of AA's ability to have live meetings. Now that's coming back now.
Sure.
But there's still a lot of people who are frightened of this damn virus, and it's that fear that keeps them from reaching out to AA until they've already started using again.
Yeah.
And that's when they call me. But the point is, this illness and the length of time it's grabbed our country and our world, for that matter, is probably the most powerful driver of addictive disease I've ever seen.
Unbelievable.
Well, and it was just reported recently that more young men between the ages of 18 and 24 died from overdose this year that died from it. It's the first time it's ever happened though. I think car accidents were number one.
Right.
This is the first time. Last year was the first time that drug overdose took effect. And I know you see it. I know Becky sees it in her work with college kids.
Right. It's tragic.
We're seeing the same thing. Folks whose lives were just booking along really nicely. All of a sudden, 2020 hits and they're finding themselves alone, not interacting, and that unfortunately that screen doesn't help. That two-way Zoom screen it almost does more harm than good.
I hate it. I mean, I do it because
Sure.
I have to.
It's alternative, which is
Right.
nothing.
But it's again going back to Murphy's book. I mean, it's that connection. It has to take place, like what we're doing right now.
Exactly.
I mean, and that's, in my opinion, the power of the recovery movement, and the power of AA and NA is that you get a bunch of people in the room, and you can literally feel at a physiological level. This is not making up. This is not voodoo. That there's this thing called limbic resonance, and being in the room literally can help people early in recovery come back to the meaning and find recovery.
Well, and I had heard early on when I got in space that the opposite of addiction isn't recovery, it's connection. And I thought that's a cute saying because AA still always cute, but it last 2 years have proven. I mean, you've got to get out of your own head.
Mm-hmm.
Someone has to help you do that. That's one of the beautiful things that has worked so well for AA. AA, however, requires you to do the work. The therapist, bring a therapist, but the clinical piece that you do, which people don't really understand, I don't think. I can tell you right now, I didn't understand it when I founded Wellwin, is that it can be the difference between success and failure in a lot of cases. Because you're not expecting, and I know the way you work, Jeff, you are, if someone doesn't respond to you, you're trying to find out where they are.
Mm-hmm.
We're following up as we do.
Right. I mean, we all have to do that. I mean, that's why when we started, I said, let's not look at this as a brain disease. We've got to look at it as a whole person disease.
That's a great way of describing it too.
So, while we're on the subject, 'cause I think that's interesting. We've nearly never discussed this. That when you go to residential treatment, a lot of the treatment centers now have gyms.
Mm-hmm.
They have dietitians. Obviously, they have therapists, psychiatrists, and I'm sure they have equine therapy. They have ropes courses and all of which can be, if they're used properly, can help. But that's been a recent phenomenon. That's not something that, I mean, I guess components of those have been there all along, but we've really just touched the surface of this thing, I think.
Well, again, this is going to predate your involvement in treatment. Back when we were doing the inpatient treatment program at Duke, when Joint Commission, the people who license and kind of bless inpatient programs, when they would come to evaluate, you had to have a recreational therapist on your staff. It was a requirement.
Right.
And then the 90s ended and the 2000s came along, and all of a sudden that just sort of fell out. And if we don't honor the importance, and it's going to sound like a weird statement, but if we don't honor the central role of play in the life of the human being, we are missing an incredible option in terms of recovery.
Yeah.
Because play, in my opinion, is one of those overlooked avenues to spirituality, and that has fallen out of a lot of the programs. You're right; it's now being brought back in, but it's being brought in, I think, as more of an afterthought rather than as an integral part of the clinical experience of that program.
So we've kind of gone around this, but I would like to delve a little more deeply in this thing because we call ourselves talk therapists we're a talk therapy program. We don't distribute drugs to help people. We refer out, as you know, to psychiatrists and so forth. talk about that piece that most people don't even think about, the spiritual piece, and why that's so important.
Well,
And explain the spiritual. Because when you say spiritual, people think religion.
Yeah, I know, and
Right.
the way I talk about addiction is it's got a biological vulnerability, a psychological liability, a social context, spiritual bankruptcy, experience, mix all of that together, and if it happens that it mix up in an unfortunate way, poof, you've got the disease. The opposite is also true. Recovery, biological resiliency, psychological flexibility, social connection, and then spiritual presence. Experience, i.e. the recovery experience, mixes that all together and you've got somebody in remission. The spiritual piece is really important. And I was talking to Macon, back in '88, I published, for the first time in my life anyway, an article on what was called the spiritual platform. And it did exactly what you're referencing. It differentiated between religion and spirituality. Religion comes from the Latin root religio, meaning obligation or rule. And that's a wonderful thing. And I think a lot of us need that structure in our lives.
Very much so, yes.
But that's very different between that and spirituality. Spirituality comes from the Latin root spiritus, meaning breath. The Greek root pneumena is in pneumonia, pneumena, meaning breathing. So you can't see whether I'm breathing.
Right. We know you are.
But right, because I'm living.
Right. Yes.
But you can't see it. You can't, and right now you can't feel it. I mean, you got real close, you could. So, like spirituality, breathing is pretty doggone important. And as an asthmatic, I have been robbed of breath periodically, and it has occurred to me that breathing is kind of essential.
Pretty much.
So the leap from there to understanding that spirituality is an essential quality of the human experience, and that, like breathing is a doing thing. It's not passive. We have to work at it. And I believe that there are 4 unique things that we as human beings do that addiction attacks and spirituality rebuilds. And they are: make choices, healthy choices, take growth-producing risks, participate in healthy relationships, and experience and live in awe and wonder. If you do those 4 things in an active way in your life, you don't have to engage some kind of external structure. You don't have to have obligation. It is a freedom of being human. And it's a celebration of the human experience. And I think that's what spirituality is. And if we can help people learn how not only to own their choices and realize how addiction takes that away, or learn their growth-producing risks, but experience them as they are experiencing them in that moment.
Which is the mindfulness piece you referenced earlier. So it's interesting because we were talking about this earlier too, that we rarely see somebody come in here, and I mean it's like almost never, and alcohol or drugs are the only problem.
Oh yeah.
I mean, 99.9% of the time there's something else that's creating the dynamic, and that's what we're trying to help them with. And you've got in the situation you just described, it's I don't think the person who has not gotten into the weeds like we have understands that. They just think they just stop drinking,
right?
That or doing the drugs. That the rest of, no, that's not the case. They're doing it for a reason. Unless that's addressed, is a good likelihood. To your point, they're gonna relapse.
Yeah, and Lewis, it's almost, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the underlying condition will actually get worse because the alcohol and drugs are serving some purpose for them. So if all of a sudden they don't take care of the primary problem and eliminate one of the things they're using as a solution, the primary is going to get worse.
Right.
And so that's the other thing is for them to understand. That's the reason it's so important to unpack that closet full of secrets and all the things that are really driving those choices. But you got to address them and you got to identify them, and that person needs to be able to be in an environment where they feel comfortable doing that.
Well, and again, as you guys know, I'm finally getting around to writing a book, and it's called Beyond Shame. and a new look at addiction. And I believe that's the piece you're talking about, Megan. That I know in my own life and in the lives of the people I am privileged to treat, when it boils down to the question, how does that alcohol, even though in the eyes of the world it is tearing your life apart, how does that alcohol, how does that cocaine, how does that marijuana, how does it help?
Right. Absolutely.
And almost invariably, it takes away the shame.
Yeah, it does.
And it's magic. And shame is like a pain in the soul. And I mean, for somebody who's profoundly shame-based, that is, I don't have words to talk about how powerful that momentary relief is. And then, of course, the tragic is that then they do things behaviorally in response to the disease
It furthers the pain.
that, yeah,
And the shame is a
it's
cyclical thing.
right, and
Yes,
it becomes
yes.
sort of, it's not a physiological tolerance, but it's a spiritual tolerance.
Absolutely.
And they get more and more and more shamed, and then what do they need? They need more of
More
their
and more.
drug.
And eventually, and I was explaining this to, I was doing a screening this week, and I was explaining to him, eventually, at least it did for me, what happens is the alcohol and the drugs become the biggest issue.
Right.
And that's the dirty little secret. It starts out patting you on the back saying, I'm going to make things better. And the whole time it's plotting how it's going to destroy your life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the dirty little secret, is that, and a lot of people don't realize it because they think, the alcohol helps me or the drugs help me. And when you explain to them that eventually that will change, there will be a complete circle, and they kind of look at you because they haven't really thought of it that way.
Well, but you also, Jeff, have this component, which I know we talk about this a lot. I mean, alcohol is acceptable. I mean, we use it socially. Megan just mentioned it. It's to a group of people, roughly 85% of the population, they can have a drink.
Right.
And it becomes not only not bad for them, it's a good thing because they're interacting with other people. That socializing we discussed. Even drugs aren't bad if they're used the way they're meant to be used. And what we've done is we've taken this one step beyond those of us that are in active addiction, and it affects, I've heard, anywhere between 10 and 15% of the population.
At least.
Okay, so let's say it's even more. Let's say it's 20%. That's still 80% of the population that it doesn't affect.
Right.
They're the one, and the problem is we have to learn to live in their world.
Well, and it makes it's not, it's going to sound like weird, it's not their fault that they don't have an alcohol problem.
Correct.
And therefore
Yes.
it's very hard for them to imagine
That's a good.
they can, if this was alcohol, I wouldn't drink that much. But if they had, for somebody who's got an active alcohol addictive issue, a half full glass of wine left on a table,
Oh, it's sinful.
it's just not.
Well, it certainly doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. But for the vast majority of people, they just forget that it's there because it's not important to them.
Right.
What's important is what you said, the interaction that's going on around that glass.
Correct.
But because they have that relationship with alcohol that is in a weird sort of way healthy, and again, we have to be careful about people drinking more than one or two drinks a day, not because they're going to have an alcohol use disorder, but because it actually now impacts, certainly for women, breast cancer. Gotta be very, very careful about that. But from a pharmacological point of view, it doesn't impact them in the same way that it does for the person who's got a substance use disorder. And what we're learning, and this, I mean, I can go off on this for days, but what we're learning is this whole epigenetic component. And that literally the use of, I mean, we've got now hard science, guys, that says that the use of alcohol and or marijuana, and there are other studies and other drugs as well, but those are the two we know the most about right now, not only change the potential genetic makeup of the fetus in the mom if that happened, but bulletin, gentlemen out there, it also impacts the genetic makeup of the sperm, and it's not like it's a genetic disease. Not saying that. I'm not saying it's passed on to another person in
Although
that way.
there is a feeling that's part of that too.
There is no question that there are vulnerabilities that are epigenetic. In other words, take place outside the normal transmission of genetic materials from the man to the dad to the mom, and they pass it on to the next generation.
Wow.
And we're still unpacking a lot of that, and it's certainly well beyond my clarity, because genetics is so complex that it hurts my head. But it is very clear that we need to start telling, not only the women know you're not supposed to drink when you're pregnant. Well, how many men know that during those 77 days, as they're developing the sperm that eventually is going to make that little baby, that if they drink a bunch of alcohol or smoke a bunch of marijuana, it's going to change
Wow.
the genetic.
And I've never heard that until you said it. Honestly, I never.
It's jaw dropping, guys. We've
Yeah.
got and yeah.
Well, it certainly would lead to the DNA to helping that. And I can say this often. I have 5 grandchildren. Every day I wonder which one of them is going to activate what I have given them.
Yeah.
You know, I just want to. And you look at other little personalities a little different. Which one is going to take this thing and run with it? Even though they're growing up knowing
Right.
what I've done, and we don't hide it in our family. It's out there, but it's going to happen.
Well, and I don't want to say that this is a quote unquote genetic disease like Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis.
Right.
But it is a vulnerability. That's that biological vulnerability piece. Then you add the shame, then you add all the things we've been talking about. So it's not like it's going to be passed directly, but a vulnerability can be. And we're just beginning to realize with such clarity that number one, a reality, and hopefully eventually we'll be able to even say, what are those vulnerabilities? I don't think we're quite there yet, but we sure know that they're there.
That's
Well, and to me, it kind of coming full circle here. That's why that mindfulness component is so important. That if you are aware of, and mindfulness to me means being in the moment here.
Yeah, showing up.
Right now, we're sitting here talking to you. I'm not worried about all that crap I got to do this afternoon or the stuff I got to do next week or what I didn't do last week. I'm here.
present.
And if you're not, if you're one of us, and you're not present, your brain takes over and takes you in places that you do not want to go, and that's what we're talking about here. Because my daughters obviously know that they are predisposed to addiction because they had me as a father. They're not active. I mean, and they make it's an action with them. They consciously take care of themselves so doesn't affect them the way it did me. And I've never even thought about the sperm count or the egg issue.
Yeah,
Well, I know about the egg issue because they tell you not to drink, but the sperm count, I've never heard about that before.
well, keep in mind, even at our age, we're still making
Yeah, that's
sperm,
true.
and every 77 days we have a new harvest, and if you're drinking or using during that time. And I had a conversation with one of my patients who's doing the in vitro fertilization, and I'm going, wait a minute, are you using now? Because he and his wife are getting ready to stop drinking, getting ready to stop, and I'm going, wait a minute, you need a longer runway. Don't start doing the fertilization treatment now. You need to get this illness under control.
Wow.
And
I've never thought about that before.
Yeah.
Have you?
No. I know that when we describe it, we always talk about there's a genetic component. We're not completely sure what that is,
Right.
but it sounds like we're getting more sure
we're getting
about
clearer.
what that is. Yeah.
We know it's there. We know it's there, making and not to help young men realize that they've got a role in being a dad in terms of the genetic piece, and obviously in terms of the rearing piece and the nurturing piece.
Yeah.
But it's so there's a lot we're learning, and that's incredibly exciting about the field. What is sad is we're having a hard time getting that information, and that's one of my roles at Duke is to meet with the researchers on a weekly basis and try to figure out ways, how do we get what we're learning in the hands of frontline clinicians so they can start talking to their patients about it.
Right. Yeah.
And it's one more struggle in this field. there is a disconnect between the major research centers in the country and clinical practice, and that going back to the spiritual platform. I mean, we know that integrative medicine as a model has showed us that spirituality, presence, mindfulness, showing up for life actually impacts and changes brains. Well, since the brain, it's not a brain disease, but since the brain is the dominant organ, we want to do anything we can to help that. And we've got to realize that those aren't just nice little fluffy things on the side. Those got to be a component of treatment.
No question
Which is
about
what you guys do here. You've got to do the mindfulness. You've got to help people learn how to relax.
it. Exactly.
I mean, there's so much that we I think take for granted,
Sure.
and it really needs to be part of treatment.
Well, but you again, we've kind of bounced around this, but part of the problem I see is because you start so young, when your mind is not even, you're not going. I remember vividly thinking when I was 18, 20 years old, I was immortal. I was Teflon. I mean, and this guy right here, he knows firsthand what happens when you drink and do drugs too much, because it's affected your ability to be treated for your issue, right?
It has, and we were talking about earlier the difference in diseases and how society reacts to them. You think about cancer. I've got cancer. Well, I can't tell you the number of studies and hospitals, and I mean, it's unbelievable. So there's anything that's being developed is already being shared all the way down the line. And for our disease, that just doesn't exist. I mean, you guys are. I mean, obviously, you're discovering some pretty important stuff, but there's really not a system in place.
Yeah.
And so I think that society's got comfortable that addiction is a disease. It's no longer a moral shortcoming. It's a disease. And so it started to be treated properly, but we got years and years to catch up.
And Macon, I wish I could agree with you. I think the three of us, I think the people at Wellwyn know it's a disease. But you take one step outside of the treatment world, the culture at large, they may say it's a disease, but then they do these weird things. Like they'll talk about if Bobby's using marijuana, he drinks a little bit too much, but the drug that's tearing his life apart is methamphetamine. That methamphetamine is his drug of choice.
Yeah.
So, Macon, what was your cancer of choice?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just nuts.
No, you're exactly right.
I'm glad we're getting this on film. I'm gonna be using that. I love that example. But
I mean, he's so right. We still do. If you're not impacted, or if you haven't a family member, or you don't experience it yourself, you kind of look at it on the horizon, and you kind of know it's a problem. But it's it's really not that important to you.
It's also a dirty little world.
Yes,
it's a dirty, and that's a guilt and shame mess that comes up.
We hide it.
We hide. Oh my Lord!
Well, not only that, but also we're embarrassed. I mean, you were talking about how I was thinking about the therapeutic relationship, and how sometimes if you go, and we invariably, when we have people at critical levels, we have to send them to the hospital to detox. If you want to be treated improperly, go to a hospital that really doesn't want you in their emergency room because you got an alcohol or drug problem. They talking about looking down on you, or let you sit there and be sick in their emergency room, waiting room for 6 hours. It happens all the time.
It does.
But if you showed up with a heart attack or you had cancer problem, they wheel you right on in, and they treat you like a different kind of citizen. And so you're right. The therapeutic relationship, when I was back in school, studying this disease, that was the first thing that my professors tried to beat into our head, how important it was to make a connection so that people would trust you, so that when you tell them your story, they believe you, that you're not just making it up. When you get into certain levels of medicine, they don't even tell you the story. You're really more, there's not a lot of money in our disease.
Or if you've got a severe opioid use disorder, you show up on an inpatient unit at Duke Medical Center, and this was back when I was working in the consulate, and I get a call from a young resident, You got to come and help us with this patient. They're drug seeking. And I would go up, and I eventually, but I'd get the treatment to him. Say, guys, I'm not trying to be ugly about this, but this is a person who has been struggling with this disease for 10 years. They've been using heroin for 10 years. They don't need to come to Duke University Medical Center to get opiates. They're perfectly capable of doing that on their own. That's not the problem. They're hurting, and you're not giving enough medication, realizing the tolerance that they have that you're not taking into consideration.
Right.
So I think there are all sorts of ways that the moral judgment that people have about this disease that I wish wasn't there and isn't in this room, but it is out there.
It
Very,
is.
very much so. We're and they and even AA does a good job of kind of pigeonholing us that have identified as alcoholics and addicts. I mean, we're part of a club,
Well,
and it's a club you don't really belong to until you're there, right?
Yeah, but what happens when that newcomer walks in the room?
I
mean, they
yes.
are the most important
Yes.
person in that room,
Amen.
and people are glad to see him for the first time in 10 years.
Yeah.
But it's a genuine connection, and people reach out, give them their telephone numbers, I mean, they're glad to see that person.
It's funny because I remember going to my first AA meeting, and this was long before I stopped, and I felt so dirty, and I just they didn't greet me the way I expected to be greeted. I guess I mean like I'm that big a deal, and I sat through this meeting and I went, that's it, kind of thing, and what I've come to find out is my head was keeping me from understanding what was going on there. I didn't want to be there to begin with. I really didn't have a problem. It was all of you guys that were the problem out there. You didn't understand me.
Yeah.
And if we could break through the guilt and shame part, we would be light years ahead of where we are now.
Well, you know what? I think one of the reasons that I know that why Jeff stays busy and why we stay busy is that people when they come in and see us, they know that they're not being judged, and they're immediately comfortable in telling the stuff that they haven't told anybody else because the guilt and shame. And so I think that's, if we do nothing else here, and for any of the people out in our industry, I think they know how powerful, because we deal with really successful people all the time. We see it at some of the inpatient centers where people really get it, but trying to make that addict or that alcoholic comfortable enough to be honest is probably the biggest work we do.
Yes.
It's so important to establish that relationship so that they can unpack what's all that stuff. One of the the reason they're drinking and using is usually because there's something else going on. And if we can get them to a place where they're comfortable telling us that, that's the start of getting better.
So you brought up your book, and you've kind of teased us with it. Can you give us some ideas of where you're going to take this?
Well, I'm
And
going to.
why now? I guess why now?
Well, I think number one, if I published it 20 years ago, people would have laughed at us. Although it's been something I've been training on and teaching on for 20 years, actually for 40 years. But I think we're now at a point where we've got to move beyond this idea that it's a brain disease. It's much more than that. We've got to realize that there is a psychological component. I am not saying that every patient that we all treat has some psychiatric illness, but to think that there's not a psychological component, i.e., in my opinion, predominantly shame and also grief and loss. When we lose something major, important to us, a dear friend dies, a parent dies,
A pet.
a pet dies,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost as if you're shame-based, you internalize that loss as your fault.
Mm-hmm.
If that person really loved me, they would. And as irrational as this is, they wouldn't have left me. They wouldn't have died. And so grief, loss, and shame are the enemies of, at a psychological level, of the patients we treat. And what this book is going to be focusing on is how do we help people first acknowledge that the shame is there, and it's going to sound weird, but realize that in and of itself, shame is not pathology. It's part of the human experience.
Right.
We all have it.
Mhm.
I have it.
Right.
We've all got it.
Absolutely.
And the problem with the people that we treat is there's usually an intensification of that shame to the point where it makes them feel so unworthy. So there's a poem that I often share with my patients, and it's I think it gets at something really important. And it's a poem by Hafiz. He's a Persian poet, and it's a translation, obviously. But it goes as follows. It's called Without Brushing My Hair. And he talked about man's relationship with the transcendent using human relationships often. Mm-hmm. And so in this poem, imagine that you have been separated for whatever reason. Your loved one has been on a long business trip, or they've been studying abroad, or whatever. So you've been waiting, called Without Brushing My Hair. And this is the way it goes. The closer I get to you, beloved, the more I can see it is just you and I all alone in this world. I hear a knock at my door. Who else could it be? So I rush without brushing my hair. For too many nights I have begged for your return, and what is the use of vanity in this late evening, in this divine season that has now come to my folded knees? If your love letters are true, my God, I will surrender myself to who you keep saying I am. In the lives of the recovering person, they've got a relationship with the God of their understanding that they know loves them unequivocally. The tragedy to me in this disease is our patients are being sent love letters all the time, but they don't even know it. They don't. It's to the wrong address, and if it happens to get into their mailbox, they don't open it. And if they open it, they certainly don't believe it. Our job, and that's what this book is about, is how do we get patients to read the love letters and believe them?
Unbelievable.
That's I love that analogy. I love that poem. We better stop right now. Never do this again. that was the most epic things that have been spoken on this podcast.
Yeah, and
but I think it's very, very true.
Yeah, Jeff, one of the things that I definitely wanted to bring up is that the purpose of this podcast is for people to have information, for us to become some kind of a resource. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure anybody that's going to watch this particular podcast will get tons of information, not just the people in our space, but also the parents and the people who are affected by this disease. So yeah, that was amazing.
Bob, do you have any idea when the book may be coming out?
Well, my hope is by the end of this year it should be done.
Yeah, good, perfect.
If it isn't, I may be in trouble with the woman in my life.
With your business partner and the love of your life.
Right.
I got you.
Right.
Well, we will definitely let people know when it's going to be ready, and we will help publicize it. I'm sure it's going to be phenomenal read. I look forward to reading it myself, obviously.
I would like to ask, we've done this off camera with a number of people. I would like to ask that you and Becky come back together. I think that would be nice because she brings a different perspective to it.
She's a powerful force.
And I mean, that's a lot of power in a very small woman.
Yeah, and I would also I would also love to find out what she's doing over for the kids, for the college kids, because we get calls. I mean, we service business executives and their families. So we get an awful lot of calls from parents who are, experiencing, they don't know what to do with that kid who hasn't launched yet. And so unfortunately, sending them on to the next level of education is an easy, quick fix. And what they're doing is they're sending somebody not prepared.
Exactly.
And when they get there, the world all of a sudden they've got a lot more autonomy, and the bad choices become greater, and they get caught up in this stuff.
Well, and to your point, 2 weeks ago we had the deans of 3 law schools here, and we did it, and again, not being in the business, I didn't think about it until they brought it out. You're talking about the kids that go to these law schools, Campbell, Central, and UNC. When these kids were in high school, they were on top of their classes. They were top of their. elementary schools, top of their junior high, middle schools, top of their high schools. They're number 1, 2, or 3 in their classes. They go to these colleges. They become, when they get their BAs or BSs, they're top of their classes there. They go to law school. They're all of a sudden they're one of many, and their egos are, and the deans are seeing it. They're seeing these like their parents, high functioning kids who have been busting their tails for years studying because they want to be a good lawyer, realize that they're just they have a good chance of being an okay lawyer. And the blow to their egos in a lot of cases drives them to drink, this came up in our discussion, but a lot of them are abusing
performance enhancing drugs, Adderall,
Adderall,
stimulants,
because they have so much reading to do. I mean, the curriculum itself is demanding, as we all know.
And they're so used to succeeding that when they feel like they're not,
There you go.
they're again, they're no longer realizing the love letters, to use that poem again, and the shame comes back.
That's
And
exactly
the shame
right.
comes flooding back, and alcohol use in the world of law students is pretty doggone ubiquitous, guys.
Very
We all
much
know
so.
that.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, and Jeff, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming over and
Oh,
doing
it's
this,
been
man.
fun.
Yeah, we've been chasing him for a while, so we're glad we got him, and getting you and Becky back will be important.
I would
for
really
us.
like that. I think this money, particularly when the book does come out, I would love, and for the record, if you'd save us a couple of books, we'll be like, okay, we don't skirt our responsibility.
We'll know that, but also I think that your book will be well received, and I think you'll be amazed at how popular
Very much
it
so.
becomes.
Well, I think it's been a long time in coming, so I'm hoping so.
Well, good. I mean, maybe that's what was supposed to happen. Maybe the lessons you learned over the last 20 years, maybe that'll make the book that much better. So we look forward to it.
Well, thank you.
Well,
Thanks
you
for
again,
coming so
Very
much.
so.
Lewis, it's always a pleasure to spend a
Yeah,
little
man.
time with you.
It's
I don't get to see you. We're business partners,
Yeah.
and yet we're always either you're going somewhere or I'm going somewhere or whatever. So it's nice to be in the office with you today.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, buddy.
Yeah.
Again, I'm Lewis,
And I'm making.
and we're the Recovery Boys.
Thanks, everybody. Go to therecoveryboys.com. This show will be posted quickly. Terry, our crack team here, will make sure that it's out. Terry's amazing. And we will see you again next week on the Recovery Boys. Lewis?
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Lewis.
I will
And
see you
thank
next
you, buddy.
week.
All right. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
Mama, take this badge from me, 'cause I can't use it anymore. It's getting